Bagnell Terrace by E.F.Benson and read by Christopher Halton. I had been for 10 years an inhabitant of Bagnell Terrace, and like all those who have been so fortunate as to secure a footing there, was convinced that for amenity, convenience and tranquillity, it is unrivalled in the length and breadth of London. The houses are small, we could, none of us, give an evening party or a dance, but we who live in Bagnell Terrace do not desire to do anything of the kind. We do not go in for sounds of revelry at night, nor indeed is there much revelry during the day, for we have gone to Bagnell Terrace in order to be anchored in a quiet little backwater. There is no traffic through it, for the terrace is a cul-de-sac, closed at the far end by a high brick wall, along which on summer nights cats trip lightly on visits to their friends. Even the cats of Bagnell Terrace have caught something of its discretion and tranquillity, for they do not hail each other with long-drawn yells of mortal agony like their cousins in less well-conducted places, but sit and have quiet little parties like the owners of the houses in which they condescend to be lodged and boarded. But though I was more content to be in Bagnell Terrace than anywhere else, I had not got, and was beginning to be afraid I never should get, the particular house which I coveted above all others. This was at the top end of the terrace, adjoining the wall that closed it, and in one respect it was unlike the other houses, which so much resemble each other. The others have little square gardens in front of them, where we have our bulbs abloom in the spring, when they present a very gay appearance, but the gardens are too small, and London too sunless to allow of any very effective horticulture. The house, however, to which I had so long turned envious eyes, had no garden in front of it. Instead, the space had been used for the erection of a big square room, for a small garden will make a very well-sized room, connected with the house by a covered passage. Rooms in Bagnell Terrace, though sunny and cheerful, are not large, and just one big room, so it occurred to me, would give the final touch of perfection to those delightful little residences. Now, the inhabitants of this desirable abode were something of a mystery to our neighbourly little circle, though we knew that a man lived there, for he was occasionally seen leaving or entering his house. He was personally unknown to us. A curious point was that though we had all, though rarely, encountered him on the pavements, there was a considerable discrepancy in the impression he had made on us. He certainly walked briskly, as if the vigour of life was still his, but while I believed that he was a young man, Hugh Abbott, who lived in the house next to his, was convinced that, in spite of his briskness, he was not only old, but very old. Hugh and I, lifelong bachelor friends, often discussed him in the ramble of conversation when he had dropped in for an after-dinner pipe, or I had gone across for a game of chess. His name was not known to us, so by reason of my desire for his house, we called him neighbour. We both agreed that there was something odd about him, something baffling and elusive. I had been away for a couple of months one winter in Egypt. The night after my return, Hugh dined with me, and after dinner I produced those trophies which the strongest-minded are unable to refrain from purchasing when they are offered by an engaging Bernist ruffian in the Valley of the Tombs of the Kings. There were some beads, not quite so blue as they had appeared there, a scarab or two, and for the last I kept the piece of which I was really proud, namely a small lapis lazuli statuette a few inches high of a cat. It sat square and stiff on its haunches with upright forelegs, and in spite of the small scale, so good were the proportions and so accurate the observation of the artist that it gave the impression of being much bigger. As it stood on Hugh's palm, it was certainly small, but if without the sight of it I pictured it to myself, it represented itself as far larger than it really was. And the odd thing is, I said, that though it is far and away the best thing I picked up, I cannot for the life of me remember where I bought it. Somehow I feel that I have always had it. He had been looking very intently at it. Then he jumped up from his chair and put it down on the chimney-piece. "I don't think I quite like it," he said, "and I can't tell you why." "Oh, a jolly bit of workmanship, I don't mean that. And you can't remember where you got it, did you say? That's odd. Well, what about a game of chess?" We played a couple of games without much concentration or fervour, and more than once I saw him glance with a puzzled look at my little image on the chimney-piece. But he said nothing more about it, and when our games were over he gave me the discursive news of the terrace. A house had fallen vacant and been instantly snapped up. "Not Naboth's?" I asked. "No, not Naboth's. Naboth is in possession still, very much in possession, going strong." "Anything new?" I asked. "Oh, just bits of things. I've seen him a good many times lately, and yet I can't get any clear idea of him. I met him 3 days ago as I was coming out of my gate, and had a good look at him, and for a moment I agreed with you and thought he was a young man. Then he turned and stared me in the face for a second, and I thought I had never seen anyone so old, frightfully alive, but more than old, antique, primeval." "And then?" I asked. "He passed on, and I found myself, as has so often happened before, quite unable to remember what his face was like. Was he old or young? I didn't know. What was his mouth like, or his nose? But it was the question of his age which was the most baffling." Hugh stretched his feet out towards the blaze and sank back in his chair, with one more frowning look at my lapis lazuli cat. "Though after all, what is age?" he said. "We measure age by time, we say so many years, and forget that we're in eternity here and now, just as we say we're in a room or in Bagnell Terrace, though we're much more truly in infinity." "What has that got to do with Naboth?" I asked. Hugh beat his pipe out against the bars of the grate before he answered. "Well, it will probably sound quite cracked to you," he said, "unless Egypt, the land of ancient mystery, has softened your rind of materialism, but it struck me then that Naboth belonged to eternity much more obviously than we do. We belong to it, of course, we can't help that, but he's less involved in this error or illusion of time than we are. Dear me, it sounds amazing nonsense when I put it into words." I laughed. "I'm afraid my rind of materialism isn't soft enough yet," I said. "What you say implies that you think Naboth is a sort of apparition, a ghost, a spirit of the dead that manifests itself as a human being, though it isn't one." He drew his legs up to him again. "Yes, it must be nonsense," he said. "Besides, he has been so much in evidence lately, and we can't all be seeing a ghost. It doesn't happen. And there have been noises coming from his house, loud and cheerful noises which I've never heard before. Somebody plays an instrument like a flute in that big square room you envy so much, and somebody beats an accompaniment as if with drums. Odd sort of music. It goes on often now at night. Well, it's time to go to bed." Again he glanced up at the chimney-piece. "Why, it's quite a little cat," he said. This rather interested me, for I had said nothing to him about the impression left on my mind that it was bigger than its actual dimensions. "Just the same size as ever," I said, "naturally. But I'd been thinking of it as life-size for some reason," said he. I went with him to the door and strolled out with him into the darkness of an overcast night. As we neared his house, I saw that big patches of light shone into the road from the windows of the square room next door. Suddenly Hugh laid his hand on my arm. "There," he said, "the flutes and drums are at it tonight." The night was very still, but listen as I would, I could hear nothing but the rumble of traffic in the street beyond the terrace. "I can't hear it," I said. Even as I spoke, I heard it, and the wailing noise whisked me back to Egypt again. The boom of the traffic became for me the beat of the drum, and upon it floated just that squeal and wail of the little reed pipes which accompany the Arab dances, tuneless and rhythmless, and as old as the temples of the Nile. "It's like the Arab music that you hear in Egypt," I said. As we stood listening, it ceased to his ears as well as mine, as suddenly as it had begun, and simultaneously the lights in the windows of the square room were extinguished. We waited a moment in the roadway opposite Hugh's house, but from next door came no sound at all, nor glimmer of illumination from any of its windows. I turned. It was rather chilly to one lately arrived from the south. "Good night," I said. "We'll meet tomorrow sometime." I went straight to bed, slept at once, and woke with the impress of a very vivid dream on my mind. There was music in it, familiar Arab music, and there was an immense cat somewhere. Even as I tried to recall it, it faded, and I had but time to recognize it as a hash-up of the happenings of the evening before I went to sleep again. The normal habits of life quickly reasserted themselves. I had work to do and there were friends to see. All the minute events of each day stitched themselves into the tapestry of life, but somehow a new thread began to be woven into it, though at the time I did not recognize it as such. It seemed trivial and extraneous that I should so often hear a few staves of that odd music from Naboth's house, or that as often as it fixed my attention, it was silent again, as if I had imagined rather than actually heard it. It was trivial, too, that I should so often see Naboth entering or leaving his house. And then, one day, I had a sight of him which was unlike any previous experience of mine. I was standing one morning in the window of my front room. I had idly picked up my lapis lazuli cat and was holding it in the splash of sunlight that poured in, admiring the soft texture of its surface, which, though it was of hard stone, somehow suggested fur. Then, quite casually, I looked up, and there a few yards in front of me, leaning on the railings of my garden, and intently observing not me, but what I held, was Naboth. His eyes, fixed on it, blinked in the April sunshine with some purring, sensuous content, and Hugh was right on the question of his age. He was neither old nor young, but timeless. The moment of perception passed. It flashed on and off my mind like the revolving beam of some distant lighthouse. It was just a ray of illumination, and was instantly shut off again, so that it appeared to my conscious mind like some hallucination. He suddenly seemed aware of me, and turning, walked briskly off down the pavement. I remember being rather startled, but the effect soon faded, and the incident became to me one of those trivial little things that make a momentary impression and vanish. It was odd too, but in no way remarkable, that more than once I saw one of those discreet cats of which I have spoken sitting on the little balcony outside my front room and gravely regarding the interior. I am devoted to cats, and several times I got up in order to open the window and invite it to enter, but each time on my movement it jumped down and slunk away. And April passed into May. I came back after dining out one night in this month, and found a telephone message from Hugh that I should ring him up on my return. A rather excited voice answered me. "I thought you would like to know at once," he said. "An hour ago a board was put up on Naboth's house to say that the freehold was for sale. Martin and Smith are the agents. Good night, I'm in bed already." "You're a true friend," I said. Early next morning, of course, I presented myself at the house agents. The price asked was very moderate, the title perfectly satisfactory. He could give me the keys at once, for the house was empty, and he promised that I could have a couple of days to make up my mind, during which time I was to have the prior right of purchase if I was disposed to pay the full price asked. If, however, I only made an offer, he could not guarantee that the trustees would accept it. Hotfoot, with the keys in my pocket, I sped back up the terrace again. I found the house completely empty, not of inhabitants only, but of all else. There was not a blind, not a strip of drugget, not a curtain rod in it from garret to cellar. So much the better, thought I, for there would be no tenants' fixtures to take on, nor was there any debris of removal of straw and waste paper. The house looked as if it was prepared for an occupant instead of just rid of one. All was in apple pie order. The windows clean, the floor swept, the paint and woodwork bright. It was a clean and polished shell ready for its occupier. My first inspection, of course, was of the big built-out room, which was its chief attraction, and my heart leaped at the sight of its plain spaciousness. On one side was an open fireplace, on the other a coil of pipes for central heating, and at the end, between the windows, a niche let into the wall, as if a statue had once stood there. It might have been designed expressly for my bronze Perseus. The rest of the house presented no particular features. It was on the same plan as my own, and my builder, who inspected it that afternoon, pronounced it to be in excellent condition. "It looks as if it had been newly done up and never lived in," he said, "and at the price you mention is a decided bargain." The same thing struck Hugh when, on his return from his office, I dragged him over to see it. "Why, it all looks new," he said, "and yet we know that Naboth has been here for years and was certainly here a week ago. And then there's another thing. When did he remove his furniture? There have been no vans at the house that I have seen." I was much too pleased at getting my heart's desire to consider anything except that I had got it. "Oh, I can't bother about little things like that," I said. "Look at my beautiful big room. Piano there, bookcases all along the wall, sofa in front of the fire, Perseus in the niche. Why, it was made for me." Within the specified 2 days, the house was mine, and within a month papering and distempering, electric fittings and blinds and curtain rods were finished, and my move began. 2 days were sufficient for the transport of my goods, and at the close of the second my old house was dismantled, except for my bedroom, the contents of which would be moved next day. My servants were installed in the new abode, and that night, after a hurried dinner with Hugh, I went back for a couple more hours' work of hauling and tugging and arranging books in the large room, which it was my purpose to finish first. It was a chilly night for May, and I had had a log fire lit on the hearth, which from time to time I replenished in intervals of dusting and arranging. Eventually, when the 2 hours had lengthened themselves into 3, I determined to give over for the present, and, much tired, sat down for a recuperative pause on the edge of my sofa, and contemplated with satisfaction the result of my labours. At that moment I was conscious that there was a stale but aromatic smell in the room that reminded me of the curious odour that hangs about an Egyptian temple, but I put it down to the dust from my books and the smouldering logs. The move was completed next day, and after another week I was installed as firmly as if I had been there for years. May slipped by, and June and my new house never ceased to give me a vivid pleasure. It was always a treat to return to it. Then came a certain afternoon when a strange thing happened. The day had been wet, but towards evening it cleared up. The pavement soon dried, but the road remained moist and miry. I was close to my house on my way home when I saw form itself on the paving stones a few yards in front of me, the mark of a wet shoe, as if someone invisible to the eye had just stepped off the road. Another and yet another briskly imprinted themselves going up towards my house. For the moment I stood stock still, and then with a thumping heart I followed. The marks of these strange footsteps preceded me right up to my door. There was one on the very threshold faintly visible. I let myself in, closing the door, I confess, very quickly behind me. As I stood there I heard a resounding crash from my room, which, so to speak, startled my fright from me, and I ran down the little passage and burst in. There at the far end of the room was my bronze Perseus fallen from its niche and lying on the floor. And I knew, by what sixth sense I cannot tell, that I was not alone in the room, and that the presence there was no human presence. Now fear is a very odd thing. Unless it is overmastering and overwhelming, it always produces its own reaction. Whatever courage we have rises to meet it, and with courage comes anger that we have given entrance to this unnerving intruder. That, at any rate, was my case now, and I made an effective emotional resistance. My servant came running in to see what the noise was, and we set Perseus on his feet again and examined into the cause of his fall. It was clear enough. A big piece of plaster had broken away from the niche, and that must be repaired and strengthened before we reinstated him. Simultaneously, my fear and the sense of an unaccountable presence in the room slipped from me. The footsteps outside were still unexplained, and I told myself that if I was to shudder at everything I did not understand, there would be an end to tranquil existence forever. I was dining with Hugh that night. He had been away for the last week, only returning today, and he had come in before these slightly agitating events happened to announce his arrival and suggest dinner. I noticed that as he stood chatting for a few minutes, he had once or twice sniffed the air, but he had made no comment, nor had I asked him if he perceived the strange faint odour that every now and then manifested itself to me. I knew it was a great relief to some secretly quaking piece of my mind that he was back, for I was convinced that there was some psychic disturbance going on, either subjectively in my mind or a real invasion from without. In either case, his presence was comforting, not because he is of that stalwart breed which believes in nothing beyond the material facts of life, and pooh-poohs these mysterious forces which surround and so strangely interpenetrate existence, but because, while thoroughly believing in them, he has the firm confidence that the deadly and evil powers which occasionally break through into the seeming security of existence are not really to be feared, since they are held in check by forces stronger yet, ready to assist all who realize their protective care. Whether I meant to tell him what had occurred today, I had not fully determined. It was not till after dinner that such subjects came up at all, but I had seen there was something on his mind of which he had not spoken yet. "And your new house," he said at length, "does it still remain as all your fancy painted?" "I wonder why you ask that," I said. He gave me a quick glance. "Mayn't I take any interest in your well-being?" he said. I knew that something was coming, if I chose to let it. "I don't think you've ever liked my house from the first," I said. "I believe you think there's something queer about it. I allow that the manner in which I found it empty was odd." "It was rather," he said, "but so long as it remains empty except for what you've put in it, it is all right." I wanted now to press him further. "What was it you smelt this afternoon in the big room?" I said. "I saw you nosing and sniffing. I have smelt something too. Let's see if we smelt the same thing." "An odd smell," he said, "something dusty and stale, but aromatic." "And what else have you noticed?" I asked. He paused a moment. "I think I'll tell you," he said. "This evening from my window I saw you coming up the pavement, and simultaneously I saw, or thought I saw, neighbour cross the road and walk on in front of you. I wondered if you saw him too, for you paused as he stepped onto the pavement in front of you, and then you followed him." I felt my hands grow suddenly cold, as if the warm current of my blood had been chilled. "No, I didn't see him," I said, "but I saw his step." "What do you mean?" "Just what I say. I saw footprints in front of me which continued onto my threshold." "And then?" "I went in and a terrific crash startled me. My bronze Perseus had fallen from his niche, and there was something in the room." There was a scratching noise at the window. Without answering, Hugh jumped up and drew aside the curtain. On the sill was seated a large grey cat, blinking in the light. He advanced to the window, and on his approach the cat jumped down into the garden. The light shone out into the road, and we both saw, standing on the pavement just outside, the figure of a man. He turned and looked at me, and then moved away towards my house next door. "It's he," said Hugh. He opened the window and leaned out to see what had become of him. There was no sign of him anywhere, but I saw that light shone from behind the blinds of my room. "Come on," I said, "let's see what is happening. Why is my room lit?" I opened the door of my house with my latchkey, and followed by Hugh went down the short passage to the room. It was perfectly dark, and when I turned the switch, we saw that it was empty. I rang the bell, but no answer came, for it was already late, and doubtless my servants had gone to bed. "But I saw a strong light from the windows 2 minutes ago," I said, "and there has been no one here since." Hugh was standing by me in the middle of the room. Suddenly he threw out his arm as if striking at something. That thoroughly alarmed me. "What's the matter?" I asked. "What are you hitting at?" He shook his head. "I don't know," he said. "I thought I saw, but I'm not sure. But we're in for something if we stop here. Something is coming, though I don't know what." The light seemed to me to be burning dim. Shadows began to collect in the corner of the room, and though outside the night had been clear, the air here was growing thick with a foggy vapour, which smelt dusty and stale and aromatic. Faintly, but getting louder as we waited there in silence, I heard the throb of drums and the wail of flutes. As yet I had no feeling that there were other presences in the place beyond ours, but in the growing dimness I knew that something was coming nearer. Just in front of me was the empty niche from which my bronze had fallen, and looking at it, I saw that something was astir. The shadow within it began to shape itself into a form, and out of it there gleamed 2 points of greenish light. A moment more, and I saw that they were eyes of antique and infinite malignity. I heard Hugh's voice in a sort of hoarse whisper. "Look there," he said. "It's coming. Oh my God, it's coming." Sudden as the lightning that leaps from the heart of the night it came, but it came not with a blaze and flash of light, but as it were with a stroke of blinding darkness that fell not on the eye or on any material sense, but on the spirit, so that I cowered under it in some abandonment of terror. It came from those eyes which gleamed in the niche, and which now I saw to be set in the face of the figure that stood there. The form of it, naked but for a loincloth, was that of a man. The head seemed now human, now to be that of some monstrous cat. And as I looked, I knew that if I continued looking there, I should be submerged and drowned in that flood of evil that poured from it. As in some catalepsy of nightmare, I struggled to tear my eyes from it, but still they were riveted there, gazing on incarnate hate. Again I heard Hugh's whisper. "Defy it," he said. "Don't yield an inch." A swarm of disordered and hellish images were buzzing in my brain, and now I knew as surely as if actual words had been spoken to us, that the presence there told me to come to it. "I've got to go to it," I said. "It's making me go." I felt his hand tighten on my arm. "Not a step," he said. "I'm stronger than it is. It will know that soon. Just pray, pray." Suddenly his arm shot out in front of me, pointing at the presence. "By the power of God," he shouted. "By the power of God." There was dead silence. The light of those eyes faded, and then came dawn on the darkness of the room. It was quiet and orderly, the niche was empty, and there on the sofa by me was Hugh, his face white and streaming with sweat. "It's over," he said, and without pause fell fast asleep. Now we have often talked over together what happened that evening. Of what seemed to happen, I have already given the account, which anyone may believe or not, precisely as they please. He, as I, was conscious of a presence wholly evil, and he tells me that all the time that those eyes gleamed from the niche, he was trying to realize what he believed, namely that only one power in the world is omnipotent, and that the moment he gained that realization, the presence collapsed. What exactly that presence was, it is impossible to say. It looks as if it was the essence or spirit of one of those mysterious Egyptian cults of which the force survived, and was seen and felt in this quiet terrace. That it was embodied in Naboth seems, among all these incredibilities, possible, and Naboth certainly has never been seen again. Whether or not it was connected with the worship and cult of cats might occur to the mythological mind, and it is perhaps worthy of record that I found next morning my little lapis lazuli image, which stood on the chimney-piece, broken into fragments. It was too badly damaged to mend, and I am not sure that, in any case, I should have attempted to have it restored. Finally, there is no more tranquil and pleasant room in London than the one built out in front of my house in Bagnell Terrace. The end.